This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
I'm not sure how much you're going to learn from this, but I think in some ways it does, this paper to some extent moves between, or occupies the space between what the previous two papers have mapped out for us, so perhaps it will be useful to some extent. I was given this brief of articulating key approaches to the study of motherhood in literature and an overview of what literature can offer to interdisciplinary studies of motherhood, and I thought, okay, fine at first. But then I found the first part really tricky, and this is the kind of first part of the talk, and I'll just try and speculate as to why, well, I'll show you why it was difficult and then say a little bit about perhaps why it might have been so. Because after second wave feminism, you would assume that in literary studies there would be many, many studies of motherhood in literature. It's an absolutely central and recurring theme in literature. So you'd expect there to be lots of studies given the context of second wave feminism, all the activity and theory that generated. But in fact, I couldn't find very many. I really found very few indeed. Marianne Hirsch is an interesting sort of founding person with the mother-daughter plot. The fact that she's moved across to work on post-memory syndrome is, I think, not related to the mother-daughter plot, if you know what she's doing in that text. So I think there's a kind of continuation of that project by other means. But the other texts were Felicity Nussbaum, Torrid Zones, Maternity, Sexuality and Empire, 18th Century English Narratives. Heather Ingman has written a book on women's fiction between the wars, looking at mothers, daughters and writing. And Julie Kipp recently, well not that recently actually, 2003, Romanticism, Maternity and the Body Politic. More recently there's an edited collection, Textual Mothers, Maternal Text, 2010, in which I think Jill has a piece. Andrea Podnikes? Yeah, yes, so you figure there. But really, there's very, very little. And it's not just a question of serious academic studies. There's also the question of critical articles, theoretical articles within literary studies. So, as preparing for this talk, I looked at everything that had been published in Contemporary Women's Writing, which is the journal that I co-edit with Susan Friedman at the moment. Plug, please submit to us. And there are 55 pieces, there are now more since I actually looked, but anyway, 55 to 60 pieces, and of those, only 2 were centred on the topic of motherhood. One of them was a wonderful paper by Margaret Homans, Origins, Searches and Identity, Narratives of Adoption from China, which started, I think was stimulated by Anne Tyler's novel, Digging to America, which some of you may know. And there was another one on Margaret Christakos, the poet Margaret Christakos, and the Maternal. So, just as an aside, I then Googled literature fatherhood studies, literary critical studies, and of course they poured onto the electronic page. There are many studies of fatherhood in literature, which have come out over the last 10 years. So this begs the question, why is there apparently, if I'm right, so little work on motherhood in literature? And this I thought was particularly striking because there are so many wonderful texts. There's so much wonderful writing on all sorts of aspects of motherhood now. And just to cite sort of my kind of, the ones that strike me, I am an admirer of Rachel Cusk, and many people don't like her, but Arlington Park. Chimamanda Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, which is a wonderful exploration of a different kind of motherhood. To some extent, Sarah Waters, Hilary Mantel, Every Day is Mother's Day, and Vacant Possession, if you know those stunning short novels. And there have been some wonderful memoirs, including Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost, which is on not being a mother, And Jackie Kay's Red Dust Road and Jeanette Winterson's Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, which are both adoption memoirs, which is a new genre which I've noticed has sort of suddenly appeared. It's fantastically interesting. Amy Holmes is another writer, The Mistress's Daughter, American writer, another adoption memoir. Very, very marvellous and suggestive texts. So I've struggled a bit to think about why we're not kind of writing about this collectively within my field, which is obviously Anglophone literature and mainly UK and US. And I think it is to do with the complex kind of negotiations involved in the transition from second to third wave feminism, which of course are bound up with wider social and cultural and psychic formations, broader psychic formations. Jane Spencer, in a book on third wave feminism, points out that the unwritten commandment, thou shalt not become thy mother, which links up again, militates against continuity within feminism, which is something we all know. And I think there's been a reaction against what I would kind of characterise as the way in which second wave feminism saw gender as reproduced via motherhood. To paraphrase Nancy Chodorow, it was not just the reproduction of mothering, it was the reproduction of gender via mothering. And that kind of focus within second wave feminism, I think, is something against which there has been a reaction. Maybe it's a kind of conflation of a discourse around a particular perspective on motherhood, which younger colleagues associate with a kind of moment that's now past. I don't know, but that's something to kind of speculate about. I certainly think it's unfortunate that particular perspective and some aspects of French feminism kind of became absolutely kind of hegemonic in feminist literary criticism, so that every single student encountered women's time. I mean, this has been going on for 30 years. It's still going on every first year course that I've taught on critical theory. We end up somehow doing women's time, and I think that's been unfortunate. There were, not because I've got anything against Christova, who's wonderful in all sorts of ways, but it's the implications of the moment of choice, if you like. And I think what's happened is that more, and this I think Andrea touched on, that socialism has become a kind of an unspeakable word, and socialist feminism has been really avoided and disavowed. There were in second wave feminism many socialist feminists who did look, as Adrienne Rich advised, at both motherhood as experience and as institution. They were important and they did do that. And I've got a quote here which I won't bother with you with, but I can put it up on a PowerPoint or something. But Susan Himmelweit, I'm not sure, in an article in Feminist Review, points out trenchantly, it's still true to a certain extent, production, or much of it anyway, is a social activity under the control of capital, socially valued and distributed through the price of its products. We might now say the product is not a thing, it's a service, or indeed it's a series of figures on a screen. But workers are paid for this, and as we all know, reproduction in the sense for having babies, and also those aspects of care that Andrea mentioned, this is not wage, this is outside the money economy. And there's no social mechanism either for its recognition and its coordination, its kind of representation, if you like, within the public sphere. And there were other earlier critics who kind of made similar points, notably I think Juliet Mitchell, whom again I think Lisa you mentioned, who does address these issues in The Longest Revolution. The thinker I'm going to draw into the discourse now is Angela McRobbie, who coincidentally is speaking now, I think at Goldsmiths today. One of my ex-students has abjected me as a mother and has gone off, postdoctoral, she's gone off to hear Angela McRobbie, which is deeply troubling. Or perhaps not, no, it's a good thing. But Angela McRobbie uses this term, disarticulation, to describe the fragmentation and dispersal of progressive social movements during the 1990s, the time of the famous backlash against feminism and a range of collectivist movements. And I love Aftermath, I don't know whether you know it. I think it does offer a wonderful account of what Robbie calls the post-feminist masquerade and the commodification of specific and non-threatening forms of gender identity. Non-threatening in the sense that they are conservative and accept the consumption and self-commodification as the duties of the, I've typed feminist, but I mean female subject. And these identities will never, ever rock the boat of neoliberal ideology. And I think very pertinently, and this relates to Andrea's paper, she highlights something drawn up by Rosemary Crompton, a sociologist, in an article, Employment, Flexible Working and the Family. And this is the social compromise over motherhood. And this is a paper in 2006, I think, so we're talking now about the present day. And I should say that's also the focus of Aftermath. Crompton explores the repositioning of women in the labour market after they've had children, and what Robbie terms the consequent, quotes, abandonment of critique of masculine hegemony in favour of compromise. And Robbie argues that working mothers increasingly draw back from entertaining any debate about inequality in favour of finding ways, with help from government, to manage their dual responsibility, a phrase that for me echoes so resonantly with the kind of work I've been doing on the post-war welfare state in the 1950s. Robbie says the compromise requires that women play a dual role, active in the workplace, primarily responsible for children and domestic life. Instead of challenging the traditional expectation that women take primary responsibility in the home, there's a shift towards abandoning the critique of patriarchy and instead heroically attempting to, quotes, do it all, while also looking to government for support in this. Now, it hardly needs to be said that the current government's cutting of support for mothers and almost every other vulnerable group in society is exacerbating the pressures inherent in this so-called compromise. And one thinks here about the abolition or the dismantling of things like Sure Start, and of course many other benefits which were available through the complex tax credit system to working families, or hard-working working families, or whatever they're supposed to be called. Okay. But I think that this compromise is an interesting one, and it's interesting that the idea that this is facilitated by government is a very interesting one, or it was facilitated by government before the arrival of the coalition government. I think also I would argue that it's possible that, sorry, I've lost what I was scrolling in here to. I think this kind of compromise is one which is made possible by the state, but of course this compromise, or rather the failure to have the capacity to think through and critique the position in which you find yourself socially, is also bound up with the quote-unquote choice that many mothers are increasingly making, affluent mothers, to be full-time mothers. That choice, of course, is not a choice. It's only possible if you are affluent. But that is a so-called choice which is being taken up still by many women. And rather than producing any kind of possibility of thinking about motherhood collectively and politically, of course, it's simply exacerbating the kind of divisions between women and the kind of disarticulation that McRobbie outlines in The Aftermath of Feminism. How am I doing for time?
8 minutes to go.
Thank you. Okay. I wasn't able to do more than say Anglophone feminist literary criticism is just not up to snuff, you know. So it's up to us. That was kind of one of my points. But I'll just go on to say a little bit about what literature could do, and a little bit about Rachel Cusk, if I may, because I just want to draw you in, even though I know she's so problematic. Okay, literary texts abound, as I've said, in representations of motherhood in all its aspects, social, political, affective. What literature can offer interdisciplinary studies, as I think most memorably and famously, I think, been defined by Bill Brown in an article in Critical Inquiry, which you may well know, Counting brackets Art and Discipline, which I think was 2009. He draws on the work of the philosopher John Dewey and suggests pithily that art enables us to experience. And I kind of get slightly bothered by this, because I think, is this some sort of revisiting of the kind of omnipotence, the claim to omnipotence of Leavisite literary criticism, or the idea that art somehow encompasses everything and there's some sort of transcendent realm. Well, perhaps not transcendent realm, but he does, in the context of this article, he does argue that literature is concerned with the way in which we can reflect on experience in the sense not just of individual consciousness, but as crossing all forms of disciplinary boundaries and the kinds of discourses of particular disciplinary positions in which we find ourselves. And so in that sense, I think his account of the role of art, in my sense I'm taking it as literature, should offer us hope in thinking about the interdisciplinary aims of this network and the ways in which we can turn to literature to illuminate, perhaps, as Jill was saying earlier on, some of the aspects of the experience of motherhood which are not necessarily represented in dominant discourses. Cusk is a very, very controversial figure. When she published her memoir, A Life's Work, on becoming a mother, there was an outcry about her work. She was accused of locking her child up in the kitchen like an animal at one point, and the book was described as pure misery to read. I loved it. What is that saying? But my point is that I think the violent reactions to the book point to the contested nature of motherhood in a post-feminist society in which it's presented on the one hand as a choice and on the other as a responsibility enjoined on mothers through what Cusk calls the public culture of motherhood. And by this I think she means the childcare manuals, the toddler groups, the discourses of domestic life and representations of it in the media. I'm sorry, I'm truly trying to skip here. The novel I'd commend to your attention is Arlington Park, 2006, where she explores the interplay between the personal and the political and social dimensions of motherhood. This text is one that focuses on women who identify themselves primarily as mothers. One of them, Juliet, who works part-time as a teacher, of English, naturally, is the one whose position is the most ambivalent and unresolved, and it is very fascinating. It's indicated through an early morning dream, which is a version of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Juliet dreams that a huge cockroach, is embedded in her skull, and she has become one with the cockroach. She has become animal, but its legs are waving in this kind of really disturbing fashion, in ways, obviously, which remind us instantly of Gregor Samsa. But the point about the dream is she realises, A, that her husband doesn't care, he's in the dream, but he's just glad the cockroach isn't embedded in him. And I think the text suggests, this metaphor suggests her feeling that her bodily integrity has been breached by the physical experience of birth and motherhood, which I think speaks to some aspects of the maternal that Lisa was talking about, but also that her, as it were, social identity, her sense of being in the social world, in the public sphere, has been attenuated, has been subject to attrition through the deposits of wasted days, as she calls them. She begins, and the text goes on to deploy other metaphors. Juliet, this character, has all her hair chopped off, and she describes this as having the chop, a metaphor which of course is used often in relation to vasectomy. So what's going on here is a kind of discourse of violence, where the violence that Juliet feels is inflicted on her, is represented through this dream. But also I think the violence which she would like to inflict on her mild-mannered, super saintly husband Benedict is also reflected through this introjection and reversal, through the metaphor of having the chop.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, I'll stop. I'll just say there's a wonderful. What can I say? Cusk. I'll come to the end. I'll skip to the end, which is what my adult children always say to me. Skip to the end, Mum. Okay. I just want to say there's a fantastic episode in Arlington Park, which I really wish you would read, where it's a reworking of To the Lighthouse, and 3 of these mother figures go to the mall. They go to a mall, and it's a brilliant exchange where the mall is living and they are dead. And my point about that is that the point about this expedition, this shopping expedition, is it relates to my final point, which is about the commodification of middle-class motherhood as it's represented in this text. And I think that metaphor, and it is the metaphoricity and the specificity of that text that has certainly thrown that into my mind as a kind of aspect of contemporary maternity. And it's something I see and I've talked about with my much younger colleagues who have young children, and it's something we've discussed. But it came out of the text, is my point. Through this wonderful episode, which I haven't got time to discuss, Cusk suggests, I think, that middle-class motherhood involves the interpellation of mothers, as consumer performers whose success is judged by the quality of very much the trappings of motherhood they acquire. It offers a sharp insight into the depression and anomie consequent on this commodification of maternal identity and its configuration or reconfiguration in terms of competitive individualism. In this respect, I am also very struck by the way in which the text does resonate for me with it seems almost deliberate that flagging up of the similarities between the experiences of contemporary full-time mothers and Friedan's 1950s housewife suffering from the problem with no name, which I think again flags up with this sense of kind of a cyclical repetition that we're all kind of picking up on. Cusk doesn't write about working class women, and I know that this is a terrible failure. I just think she's a really good writer. So it's a bit like Virginia Woolf, again. But she does, I think, isolate the currents of feeling that circulate in middle-class motherhood with really surgical precision. And in particular, she highlights the internalisation of external pressures, which are converted into either guilt or self-blame or melancholy. And in this way, she interrogates the disarticulation of what could have been a female coming together in relation to motherhood as contemporary motherhood as experience and institution. Thank you.